All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So excited to see you all here. You are joining the Yes, 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 just like that webinar on pleasure related to sexual health, HIV prevention, and so forth. We have a really amazing panel today of presenters, and we're going to have really great discussion. So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A, and I'll go over that a little bit in a moment as we go through some opening slides. I should introduce myself. My name is Jim Pickett, and I'm a senior advisor with AVAC and running this new project we have called the Choice Agenda. This is actually our second official webinar for the Choice Agenda. The first one was focused on contraception and why effectiveness is not the only thing that matters to people. It was super interesting. That was last month. And going forward, I'm going to share with you what we have coming up in August, which we're really excited about. So why don't I go ahead and start sharing some slides here. So the call is being recorded. Your presence equals consent to the recording. We'll take questions after each presentation, just for clarification. And then once all the presentations are complete, we'll do a full kind of discussion and more Q&A. Please feel free to comment and ask questions, share info and resources in the chat, and raise your hand to speak on camera. So if you want to speak loud and show your face, let's see that happen. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Really important, we will be sharing the links to this recording and the slides in a follow-up email. Those resources can also be found on that website there. We'll be sharing the link in the chat. So we will have access to all this. We know a lot of people register for things and aren't able to attend because of scheduling. So we want to make all these things super available to you. We have for instance, over 235 people registered today. And right now I'm seeing about 70 people online. So we definitely want to make sure things are available to everyone for future use. So I wanted to share quickly where we're all coming from today. I don't know, I'm pretty impressed by this. Like, whoops, I went too quick. Multiple countries, hold on. And so hopefully you see your country on there. I had to keep adding as more registrations were coming in. So it's quite an impressive array. Please, in the chat, tell us where you're zooming in from. If you haven't already, let us know where you are zooming in from today. And we'll see just how much the world is being embraced by pleasure right now. So please go ahead and do that. I want to see that chat blowing up. I don't quite see it blowing up, so I might have to wait. Last thing I see is Brooklyn and Chicago, but I know there's people from all over the place. Hello, France, Sweden, India, thank you. Thank you. Okay, we'll go on. So here is what you all noted in your registrations. A lot of you are already doing things that bring in pleasure into the work around HIV prevention. So here are some examples. They're not all of them, but some of them. So encouraging the use of lubrication, demonstrations with condom demonstrations, using a dildo in your mouth, sexual health goals, setting sexual health goals during a PrEP consultation, doing sex positive risk reduction work with adolescents. And really importantly, I kind of highlighted two things that are kind of overarching. So recognizing pleasure as an important aspect of human sexuality and reducing stigmatizing language and fostering a stigma-free environment without shame. Those things are really overarching, and some of these others are just really great ideas or great actual applications of those ideas. I definitely want, if someone on the call is behind the Pop It to Block It social media campaign that I note here, I would love to see that, and I'm sure everyone else would too. It's a great catchy tagline. So please put that in the chat. We'll be saving all of the resources that are shared in the chat. So when we send out the recording and the slides to you all and post these online, we'll also have a document with all the resources that you all are sharing. So we hope you share things that, other things that you're doing, so we can all learn from each other. We're all doing amazing work around the world, I'm sure. So yes, please leave examples and links in the chat. And one way to engage in promoting pleasure, and our first speaker is the head of the founder and the lead pleasure maven of the world, really, and the head of the Pleasure Project, Ann Philpott. Their organization is taking and seeking endorsements, so organizational endorsements for groups that endorse their principles. And you can go and check them out online at that link. We'll be dropping that link in the chat. AVAC is an endorser. You can see some other endorsers here. This isn't the full list. I had to cut some off just for graphic beauty. But please consider checking that out and endorsing the principles. And I'm sure Anne will talk more about this when she speaks shortly. So what's next from the Choice Agenda? I'm excited to tell you that our next webinar is on August 8th. It's called Faster, Smarter, and More Equitable, Accelerating the Rollout and Uptake of CAB for PrEP. Obviously, this is a huge issue all around the world. It's a brand new intervention, lots of challenges with it. While it has many promises to, I think, see those promises made good, we have a lot of work to do, no matter where you are in the world. The US has CAB already approved, and there's precious few people in the entire country who are on it, very few. So we will have a number of really great speakers, including Rachel Bagley from the WHO. The WHO is releasing new CAB guidance at the big AIDS conference coming up in a couple weeks in Montreal. So she'll be talking about that. We have some prescribers who are prescribing CAB, long-acting CAB for PrEP. Mitchell Warren from AVAC is going to be talking about kind of the global issues, really outside of the US, focusing outside of the US, and how we're going to roll this thing out. And we're looking to also include someone in the United States who's already using CAB for PrEP. In the United States, it's called Apretude. So you can see the URL there to register, and we'll also drop that in the chat so you can click on it directly and register right now if you want. So one more thing I want to kind of plug here is we have a Choice Agenda Listserv, which is really a forum for discussion, for discovering new information, and for debating. So many of our lists are kind of one directional, they're newsletters or they're announcements, and there's no way to really engage or have a conversation. This is more about a global conversation, hearing from different people in different parts of the world and their experiences, their opinions, what works, what doesn't. We can learn a lot from each other. So we're really trying to build up this list. We're now at 529, so I'm really excited about that. I'm hoping that you're on it. If you're not, all you need to do is email me, and we'll drop that in the chat as well, so you can click on it. And you can just let me know you want to be part of the list, and I'll add you and encourage you to join in the conversation. I want to highlight those pictures that I have there at the bottom next to the Choice Agenda logo are images from some fierce Ugandan advocates who were recently did a march in Uganda in support of the depivorine ring. So that's another new intervention that is seeing some struggles with moving forward. And so activists are really taking to the streets and demanding that this that various funders and organizations and agencies that are kind of holding this up get off their butts and stop doing that. I want to share with you, I think just before we get started with our presentations, I'm going to share with you a clip from that march as a bit of inspiration and to remind us that nothing happens without activism, nothing happens without us. If we're going to have interventions we want, if we're going to include pleasure in our interventions, which we should be, we need to be standing up for this, demanding it, fighting for it, marching for it, all of those things. So I just realized I don't have the sound shared. So if you give me a second, let me share sound on that so you can hear their voices. It's much better when you can hear them. Let me see now. Oh, all these crazy animations. Okay, bear with me. Hopefully you'll be able to hear this now.
Prevention! My choice! My ring! My choice! My ring! My choice! My vagina! My choice! My vagina! My choice! My vagina! My vagina! My choice! My vagina! My choice! My vagina! My choice! Akawata! 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 Kume! HMV! Yambala! Akawata!
So hopefully that gets you in the mood for some amazing speakers that are coming up just like that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And while I do that, I am going to invite, hold on here. I am going to invite Anne Philpott to go ahead and share her screen. And while she's getting that sorted out, I'm going to remind you that she is the founder of the Pleasure Project, where we were sharing the information about the pleasure principles. She's one of I think the foremost pleasure mavens. I think there's another word you like to use, Anne, but pleasure principle of the world. Like Anne is, if we're talking about pleasure and sexual health and HIV prevention, Anne is there in terms of pleasure. And so we're really excited to have her kick off today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the talk over to you, Anne. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. And I just want to know where I can join the My Vagina March. Where's the next one?
Yes, if people know if there's more things happening like that, please put that in the chat. That just happened in Kampala last week, I think late last week, put on by UNASO in Uganda. So they were really quite amazing and very inspirational.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having the Pleasure Project and having me and hosting this talk. It's brilliant. I've shared the screen. I hope you can see it. I can't tell if you can. Maybe Jim, if you can let me know.
It looks great, Anne.
Brilliant. Yep. Fantastic. So I'll just go right ahead, but just to say that the Pleasure Project has been running since 2004. It was born out of frustration, to be totally honest, which many of you all know about, but just the fact that I was going to events, global AIDS conferences, and just one day, I just got so frustrated that these conferences were acting like HIV was an airborne disease. And I thought if a Martian landed from outer space at one of these conferences, they would in fact think this was an airborne disease. Nobody was talking about sex. Nobody was talking about how to have good, safe sex. And so the Pleasure Project was born, and we were a, like-minded activist collective, I would say, putting the sexy into safer sex and waving the pleasure flag at these conferences and putting up our provocative posters. And so it's an absolute delight to see all of the comments at the beginning of this talk with people talking about all of the amazing pleasure work that they're doing. That really is, there's really a pleasure wave now, and it's so exciting to have you all on the call and to have this webinar. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a bit about the state of the evidence. I know you're all really interested in that. And I'm also going to talk about how we've translated the evidence into what we're calling the pleasure principles. And we're delighted that AVAC has signed up and has endorsed the pleasure principles. And we really hope that you will too. That's a way of taking the evidence and putting it into action. So but before we do that, I want you all to just sit quietly for a moment. I know we've all been on a lot of these Zooms, and whatever time it is. It might be your breakfast, it might be your lunch, it might be your nighttime snack time. And I want you all to just think about the best meal you ever had, or food that you really enjoy, or food that's really, really delicious. And was it, you know, who it was cooked by? Like, why was it so delicious? Why did it taste so good? Like, you know, was it the spices on the food, on your lips? Was it because it was prepared with love for you? What was it about that particular bit of food or that meal or the context in which you ate it that really means that it was your most pleasurable eating experience? And just sit there for a moment and think about that. And I hope you've conjured up that image in your mind. And just hold that for a moment, hold that thought. And now think about your most pleasurable sexual experience. Is that, it might be on your own, it might be with somebody else, it might be with a range of people. Just think about, what was it about that experience that was so pleasurable? Again, was it about the way it felt, how you felt, who it was with? And conjure up that in your mind also. And then I just want you to reflect on which of those two was easiest. If you had to talk about your most pleasurable eating experience and your most pleasurable sexual experience, which one of those would you find easier? The vast majority of people that I talk to find that food and the sensual experience around food is so much easier to be able to articulate, and why. And find it really hard to articulate and be able to speak about when we really enjoy sex. What is it about sex that we enjoy? What's the kind of sex that we want to have in the future? And that's really because that conversation has been silenced for us. We almost all universally grow up in situations of sex shaming. Some of us have a lot more sex shaming because of our discriminated against sexual identities. But we almost all universally have some experience of feeling shame about being able to articulate what we want in our sex lives. And that's really what pleasure-based sexual health is about. It's about reducing that silencing and that shame. And why is pleasure important? Well, why do people really have sex around the world? But also why pleasure is important. And this comes from the World Association of Sexual Health's technical document, which accompanies their new sexual pleasure declaration. And really, I won't read it out, but really what they're saying is that what we've done in the sexual and reproductive health world is we've taken a particular element of our sexualities and we've silenced that part. We haven't discussed that at in global AIDS conferences, in our sex education, but without talking about pleasure, we're not engaging with the whole person. We're not engaging with the fact that sexual pleasure is a missing link between informed decision-making, the reasons why we have sex and relationships and love and sexual health. And so this is also from the World Association of Sexual Health technical guide to their new global declaration of sexual pleasure. And I've just taken some elements from that technical guide about why sexual pleasure is important. As I said, you know, research has found that pleasure is a fundamental reason people have sex. Sex can improve your health. It can you know, improve your immune response. It can reduce your stress. It can be, pleasure can be an indicator of empowerment. It can, we've all, you know, probably heard about the orgasm gap or the female pleasure gap. And we can really work towards challenging stereotypes that reinforce these damaging norms about masculinity and femininity. But also we found that pleasure-based sexual health can be particularly effective with people who have experienced trauma. So trauma-informed pleasure-based sexual health is very effective because people who have had trauma are given that hope and that vision of being able to experience pleasure after that trauma. And also it's important to recognize that pleasure and sex positivity has been a part of faith, belief, and historical and pre-colonial narratives. So it's not something which is exclusively Western or north of the globe, but that you know, discussions and narratives and practices have been diminished by those colonial narratives. And of course, the World Health Organization and important commissions such as the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission have highlighted the importance of pleasurable and safe sexual experiences. And the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission talked about the pleasure gap and how it's important to focus on the rights of individuals to have safe and pleasurable sexual experiences. This is the Pleasure Project's definition of pleasure-based sexual health. This is the first time there was a definition of this. We came up with this 3 years ago. This is all available on our website, and we moved a step beyond the existing definition by IPPF of a sex-positive approach to sexual health to really define a celebration of sex and sexuality and joy and well-being, and the importance of focusing on the objectives of the programs and the people that we serve, focusing on that exactly, well-being, desire and pleasure, and how closely linked that is to agency and empowerment. You know, as I say, how can we know what we want to say no to if we're never taught to say yes to things? We have to have the yes side of the equation to be able to deliver effective sexual health interventions. So now I'll get onto the research. So there's been 3 reviews of whether pleasure, inclusive sexual and reproductive health, improves sexual and reproductive health. And there's 3 reviews. There was one in 2006 by Scott Sheldon that looked at the impact of eroticizing condom use, and they did a meta-analysis. We did a literature review, which again is available on our website. You can see the front of it there, looking at the importance of sex, pleasure and health. And then very importantly, the Pleasure Project, together with the World Health Organization and support from the Case for Her, did a systematic review, a meta-analysis of evidence over the 15 years of research up to 2020. All these 3 reviews found that there was robust evidence, limited evidence, we want more, but robust evidence that pleasure-inclusive sexual health reduces risk-taking, improves condom use, and increases sexual self-efficacy or confidence. So the confidence to make the choices that you want to make. So the answer is, do positive attitudes to sex correspond to positive attitudes to safer sex? And the answer is definitely yes, and increases condom use. This is from our literature review. So this is the question we asked. And a systematic review, I'm sure many of you are aware, but a systematic review is a gold standard way of looking at all of the evidence or all of the research that has tried to have an impact on sexual health and reproductive health. And we looked at the period of 2005 to 2020. So it was a huge undertaking, and we had to throw the net very wide because pleasure is not a keyword search on the health research databases. And in fact, sexual health was not a mesh term until 2016, which is quite shocking in itself. But we asked this question: do sexual and reproductive health interventions which incorporate sexual pleasure improve relevant health outcomes? And you'll see there on the slide what the relevant health outcomes are. And we also very carefully defined what we saw as pleasure inclusive. Each of these studies we found that we then included in the systematic review compared pleasure inclusive interventions with usual care. So what we might be more familiar with, like disease focused or fear based or non-pleasure inclusive sexual health. And this is just a graphic to show you in a more fun way what the results were. Basically, we did a meta-analysis of and included 8 studies that we were able to pool condom use as the outcome. But basically, pleasure in sexual health leads to good, safe sex. And I will show you here, for those of you who are really interested in meta-analysis, and I know there's a lot of researchers on the webinar, you may understand what this is, but these were the 8 studies we were able to pull for condom use. As you'll see, what's really important here is that they all favored the intervention of pleasure-based sexual health. And actually the Cohen's effect size was 0.37, which is really significant for a behavioral intervention. That's up there with, other very effective behavior change interventions, such as, introducing cook stoves that don't have smoke that damage your lungs. It's up there as a really high effect size, a Cohen's effect size. And this was some of the stats. For the final screening, we screened over 7,000 articles and included 33 studies. They were from mainly from the US, partly I think because of the HIV funding for research in the US, but we also had studies from Nigeria, South Africa, Spain, Brazil, Singapore, and you'll find the link to our article. We can put that in the chat. We also observed that there was a spectrum of pleasure inclusivity, from the ones that we would see as really gold standard randomized controlled trials and interventions that included pleasure. There's an example there from the MIDEX study, also the Sister Love research, which is fantastic. But then we also included, because there's such a not enough, or there's such a lack of pleasure inclusive work, we included those that were also more borderline, but actually did include some pleasure and were not sex negative. And this is the conclusions. That's the article in the top right there. You can also find that on our website. It's open access. Anybody can download that. But basically, we all concluded that future SRHR work should incorporate pleasure. And, you know, this is really important. This is the first time, as far as I know, that the World Health Organization has done a study of this nature. We did a webinar with them. It was massively well attended. This is a significant shift to now have this credible evidence. And not only is it important in that pleasure gets more credibility, but also we now know that pleasure inclusive interventions increase condom use and save lives. So they make, you know, it means that the work that we've been doing up to now and all the billions of dollars that have been put into HIV prevention has not been as effective as it could have been. This needs to be right up there as a critical new intervention to make sure that we're doing the very best we can with HIV prevention, saving lives, you know, improving prevention. Okay, and then just very quickly, these are 3 critical documents that might be really important for you to advocate for your pleasure work. Here's the WAS Declaration on Sexual Pleasure. I think that came on the listserv just before this webinar. That's accompanied by a technical guide that is a long document, but has a huge amount of information about why pleasure is important in healthcare, for health, for, you know, a whole range of different factors. And then the third part of this kind of pleasure suite is the pleasure principles, which we have done in partnership with WAS, but also as the kind of practical accompaniment to the evidence and the new policy, the new normative policy. And this is the first time there's been a global normative agency issuing a sexual pleasure declaration. And WAS was the agency that first put out a declaration on sexual rights, which now we kind of take as a norm. And I'm hoping that this now will become the norm in the years ahead. And I'll just quickly, and then I'll round off, just kind of give you a quick illustration of the pleasure principles, which again are on our website. They are very practical, very inspirational. They're not a checklist. They're really a way that you can see how to take this evidence and policy and make it practical for you as a person, for you as a professional. And they really build out of the evidence, but we've included lots of case studies, lots of tips. At its very center is the criticality of being positive, shifting the narrative away from the focus that we've had in the sexual health and HIV worlds to the consequences of sex that are negative, such as, you know, disease and death, to flipping it to what's possible in terms of a vision of good, safe sex. But we also, I won't go through all of them, but there's one which is, I think, universal, the importance of recognizing that we all have the capacity to feel pleasure if we want to. And of course, the importance of sexual rights, which is absolutely the backbone of pleasure-based sexual health. And then one of my favorite, which I shouldn't have a favorite, but it is Love Yourself, which is about recognizing the journey that we've all been on and the experiences that we've all had, and how we need to love ourselves in terms of being sex educators that can bring that, you know, bring ourselves completely to our roles as sexual health practitioners. I think I'm just about finished, but I'm about to say, just enjoy the pleasure wave. Please endorse the pleasure principles. We're thrilled that AVAC and the other organizations have. Do Many people are now on our global mapping of pleasure. We'd love to have you on there if you're practicing pleasure-based sexual health. And my final slide is just an example. I know many people from IPPF are here. They have a fabulous campaign in Africa at the moment called Treasure Your Pleasure, which is about getting more people into services by taking a pleasure-based approach. Thank you. That's me finishing off. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a really wonderful overview of the amazing work that you all have been doing, and actually finding and creating and doing research that proves that this isn't just a nice thing to do. This is a really incredibly important thing to do. So thank you for that. I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to ask a follow-up question. You can raise your hand and I'll see you and call on you. If there are any follow-up questions before we move on to our next speaker. And I'll just throw one out there and we'll have plenty more time for conversation when our speakers are done. But I know a number of questions came in and while people were registering. And I think there are folks in different parts of the world and countries where things are more conservative. So they're kind of struggle, like how do you kind of embrace the pleasure principles when you're dealing in a climate that can be harsh. And we're seeing that starting to happen in the United States, right? We're seeing rights being ripped away from women. And we see things on the horizon that are going to make it harder potentially for LGBT people to exist in our country and around the world. So I just wonder, it's a huge question, but how do you kind of get started embracing pleasure when you're in a climate that is anything but?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's a quite common thought, I guess, or common concern. Our pleasure principle, Be Flexible, is all about this. It's about how to take pleasure-based sexual health into your own context, into different contexts. As you say, as you rightly say, how we define a challenging context, can change pretty fast, right? And, like you say, what we're seeing in the US. What we found is that one thing that can be really helpful is focusing on the heritages of pleasure in that context. So looking exactly, as I said, on the practices, the conversations that have happened historically in that context, and challenging the notion that pleasure is something that's being imposed by an outside country. There's some great examples of organizations, for example, in India that have used heritage of pleasure. Agents of Ishq is great at doing this. And they use poetry, the ancient texts in India, which are infused with pleasure, with the nuances of desire, and use those to really start a conversation because you can also, gently bring people in with the music they love, with the poetry they love, or with the experiences and the heritages in that context. And, we've actually found that people have been incredibly receptive. It's more people from other countries that are concerned that it might not land well. And I, consistently challenge this kind of gatekeeper approach that, pleasure isn't, I've had the ridiculous statement put to me that pleasure isn't something that is African. Pleasure is universal, right? And there's some great examples of organizations in Africa, like, from Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, for example, or, the work that this Treasure Your Pleasure campaign, which is really celebrating and doing it in a very context specific way, in a way that people will really welcome it. So I think, look at our principle, Be Flexible. It's got some great examples in there. Recognize and honor your heritages of pleasure. Again, it's about challenging the sort of maybe the more recent overlaying colonial Christian narratives on the top of what was already there. And, I think sometimes hold a mirror up to what can be kind of gatekeeping by other communities.
Thank you for that brilliant answer. And I think you give a lot of us, some hope and some inroads. And I think it's really important this notion that it's often people from outside who are kind of gatekeeping and stopping this conversation from happening. So those old colonial attitudes are not so old. They continue to be fomented, unfortunately, around the world. So thank you, Anne. And I know you just happen to have a colleague sitting right next to you who's a collaborator. Yay, hi, Dr. Joao Neto. Really happy to have
it's a
him
pleasure.
as our next speaker.
Yeah,
Joao is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist and researcher. He is affiliated with universities in Brazil and Portugal. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joao to share his slides and walk us through his presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
I thank you, Jim. I thank for the inviting and say that
now you just want to be on slideshow?
yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and tell about a little bit of my work, and saying that yesterday I was in an event and a phrase just born, and really pertinent to use here with you. That is the pleasure is a portal to an inclusive sex, gender, relationship, diversity, and health and education professional spreads. I think there is the great challenge that we have. And when you think about health, and when you think about sexual health, when you think about mental health and well-being, I think that it is important to amplify those kinds of concepts to include the sex, gender, and relationship diversity. So, yeah, thank you. Health and education, I think that those environments and those contexts are so important to promote pleasure and sex positivity and to achieve higher levels of well-being and mental health. Sometimes there are some kinds of myth associated with the concept of sexual health and sexual behavior, and what do we associate with it in our day-by-day life, and what we do with it, and thinking about the necessary view, a positive view of it in our lives. So this kind of context is so present in the education and the health, and so those things need to be discussed, and we need to understand why does diversity is not included and is not so easy to work with it. So one thing to try to get into a new or a different environment thinking about inclusion is that express authentic selves increase capacity for intimacy and sexual autonomy. So it is necessary to collapse that kind of limited hierarchical models and moving away from that kind of reductionist binary constructs of gender. We need to create pleasure-based models of sexuality encompass wealth and breadth of human desire and experience. It means that we need to know what exactly happens with our prejudice and stigmas, or what kind of prejudice and stigmas do we experience in your day-by-day life. As a member of the LGBTQ community, I can say some things are so huge and so intense in our lives that we have to get in contact with it, and for sometimes it's so difficult to move in a way. We know that homosexuals have 4 times more chance to commit suicide. Transsexual have 10 more times chances to commit suicide. Those are information that are so important to think about what kind of impact do the prejudice and stigma have in our lives. Brazilians transsexual life expectation is of 37 years old. It means that, well, what does people have to do to still living? What does people have to do to consider their rights? And the basic rights, for example, is to still alive. Social and economic world price is estimated between $32 billion per year. And it is associated with prejudice and stigma. That situation decreases public funds and decreases the possibility to increase health and education. So to get to that kind of situation, we need to think about the difference of a friendly and a competent context. Friendly contexts are associated with inclusive and committed to equity and social justice. It goes to reduce prejudice and stigma. Competent contexts are associated with the intensifying such issues and get more effective in this reduction. Competent professional spreads are associated with reduction of disparities present in minority groups and the discussion about the necessary difference for effective actions. And those kinds of discussion of the specific needs that the minority groups needs to get more equity and equality in their rights are connected with the development of cultural competence. Cultural competence favors democratic, participatory, and progressive threats, and the promotion of human rights and inclusion. It incorporates inclusive knowledge and practices, cognitive, behavioral, and relational. Those are topics that we have to consider when you are thinking about cultural competence, and aims to achieve awareness, sensitivity, competence, and domain. So thinking about that things, we are developing a research, and it's occurring, and I'm trying to tell you some kinds of information that we got from that research. That research aims, what do you want to know? What are the potentialities and impacts of a comprehensive continuous training co-constructed program in sex, gender, and relationship diversity, inclusive sexuality, integrating sex positivity and pleasure for Brazilian and Portuguese health professionals in terms of their knowledge, attitudes, and practices. Those focus are so important for us because we need to know exactly what does the LGBTQ community needs to increase the rates of education and health. This is the panel of that research, and it involves some associations, universities, and another kind of companies in Brazil and in Portugal, the places that we are developing it. That kind of course, that training course, is based on case studies, so it's almost focused on the practice of the professionals, and designed to use remote learning, analyzes the trainees' production, and the pre and post test on sexuality, sexual well-being, and LGBTQ inclusive sexuality education. The training courses show us that there are a lot of invisibility about the LGBTQ necessities, and what you have to do to include, to be more inclusive of the sex, gender, and relationship diversity. Sexual diversity has less attention in sexuality education. We could find it, content to all education levels. It only changed when there were situations of prejudice against LGBTQ students committed by teachers, school staff, fellow students, and youth themselves. There are some concerns about it because if there are no problems, or if they can see, better saying, if they can see the problems are not faced. Absence of sex positivity view and pleasure principles is present in all of those levels of education. Those situations are a problem because we know that in Brazil and also in Portugal, we have low rates of scholarly and health in the LGBTQ population. We can find that 73% of travestis and transsexual usually abandon or evade school. LGBTQ inequity in healthcare is present in those environments. Absence of LGBTQ profile data in the census survey. We don't exist in the census survey in those countries. The disregard for issues related to LGBTQ health in the health courses curriculum. The professionals don't know how to do and what they have to do with that situation. Absence of inequity, assistance inequity, better saying, it's so present. And there are a lot of heterosexist professional attitudes. So we think that that kind of course and the digital classroom community promoted relevant discussions and facilitates trainee engagement to build thought-provoking topics and considering pleasure, considering well-being, and considering mental health. The course increases the knowledge, conscientiousness, and sensitivity of the LGBTQ students' needs and how to support them. This is a very important topic to consider, reinforcing the importance of this training. So we have to educate ourselves to work with the diversity and work with LGBTQ community to increase their level of education and health. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Joao. Really interesting. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think before we move on to our final presentation, I just want to ask, since Anne and I had started talking about colonialism and the role of colonialism up until the present, thinking about, are there differences between what's happening in Portugal and what's able to be accomplished in Portugal around pleasure, for instance, compared to Brazil? Considering the history of Portugal and Brazil, are there differences that you could relate back to colonialism and the impacts of colonialism?
Well, that kind of situation is so huge in Brazil because we don't have exactly a kind of in structure to develop education and health. Trying to construct that kind of structure and thinking that we need to include LGBTQ population, it means that we have to getting away from some pre-existing structure to thinking about education and to thinking about health. Brazil has a lot of contradictory situation. For example, Brazil is a country that consumes a lot of pornography, transgender pornography. At the same time, Brazil kills a lot of transgender people. The aggression against the LGBTQ population is so high. At the same time, there are a lot of influences from the culture that improve what is the consciousness or the express of the LGBTQ selves of themselves. So I think that it is very important to thinking about what does those country needs in terms of education and health, considering the differences between Brazil and Portugal. Portugal is so, we can't see exactly so much aggressions against LGBTQ population, but there are some microaggressions every day in life in Portugal. Portugal know what happens and what is needed, but don't know how to do it. So invisibility is present in those contexts and in those countries, and the influences we have about with the colonialism that we lived in Brazil for so a large period, it influences nowadays what people need to do and what people thinking about those kinds of situations.
Thank you for that, Joao. I know that was a big loaded and complicated question, and thank you for giving us some insights. So I'm now going to turn it over to our final speaker, Christine Curley, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut. She is a lead author on a recent review called Pleasure and Prep, a systematic review of studies examining pleasure, sexual satisfaction, and prep. And I just want to note that the publication date is January 28th, which is my birthday. So I feel like it was really published for me. But I know it's for the world and it's for all of you. And now we're gonna ask the Pleasure Project folks to stop sharing their screen and invite Christine to go ahead and share her screen and walk us through her review. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, I will try to do this. I haven't done a panel presentation in a long time. Okay, here we go. All right, just let me know. I'll put this on. Start the show. Start the share. Is that the right screen or the wrong screen?
Yep, you're in presentation mode. It looks beautiful.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jam, for inviting me onto this panel. I'm kind of awed by being on the same panel as Ao and Joao. But this is my systematic review of studies examining pleasure, sexual satisfaction, and PrEP. I'm going to skip through some of these slides rather quickly because a lot of this stuff has been covered by our earlier presenters. First, a little bit about me. As Jim said, I am a PhD candidate at UConn. I work with Blair Johnson, who is one of the preeminent scholars in systematic reviews and meta-analysis. I'm very new to this field. This is my second career. So I like to say that it is wise eyes and fresh eyes. So I came to HIV through a T32 and have really appreciated diving into the aspects of pleasure as opposed to sexual risk. So this systematic review is focused on pleasure, sexual satisfaction, and PrEP. Obviously, our former speakers, especially Anne, has taken care of pleasure, and I assume the rest of you are very familiar with PrEP. So I just want to take a minute to review how I define sexual satisfaction in my research. So first, I look at it as a separate from sexual function, which means sexual satisfaction should be looked at more subjectively, not in the context of measuring frequency or orgasms, but really how each individual looks at their positive and negative aspects of their sexuality. When we define sexual satisfaction that way, you can see certain connections between sexual satisfaction and well-being. I'm in the process of doing a systematic review for study one of my dissertation that is looking across 27 studies over 29 countries, looking at the connection with sexual satisfaction and measures of well-being. And what we're finding is sexual satisfaction is associated with all of these higher positive well-being goals: subjective well-being, life satisfaction, psychological well-being, and longevity. On the flip side, sexual satisfaction is associated with lower anxiety, depression, and physical symptoms. So in short, sexual satisfaction is something that is a goal that is part of us as humans. I'm also in the middle of a series of 3 studies right now that I'm conducting with undergraduate students and graduate students, essentially that group of emerging adults. And we're finding the same things, that higher comfort with sexuality, which is really sex positivity, is significantly related to lower depression and anxiety, which, as many of you might know, in especially the young adult population, levels of anxiety and depression are quite high right now. Also, higher sexual satisfaction is also significantly associated with lower depression. So here are some background concepts on systematic review that we're going to be talking about today. First of all, as part of my T32 training in HIV, we were bombarded with sexual risk behavior. And in my mind, I said, wait, where's the pleasure? Where's the fact that sexuality is a good thing? And I found, looking at these reviews, that PrEP intervention tends to focus on prevention, risk reduction, and adherence, which are all good things. But as Anne mentioned earlier in her talk, not all of that is working. Despite the billions of dollars thrown at HIV prevention, the risk focus hasn't been working. So I aim to do a systematic review looking at sexual motivations for PrEP uptake and adherence. And those motivations include increased physical pleasure, increased sexual intimacy, increased sexual opportunity, and reduced sexual anxiety. All of those things are possible ways of increasing the messaging and increasing the uptake of PrEP, increasing safer sex. So this is your basic Prisma flow chart of the literature review. The bottom line is, after reviewing several hundred manuscripts, there was included in the systematic review 16 studies. Those 16 studies, and here are the characteristics, are a mix of quantitative and qualitative. And what's really important about having qualitative studies is that we get to hear from the actual voices of the participants. You get to hear about the lived experiences of individuals on PrEP, individuals willing to be on PrEP. The systematic review also covered 7 countries, as mentioned, predominantly United States, but it does include other areas of the world. In addition, it's over 2,600 participants, mainly men and mainly sexual minority men. Only 2 studies examined both partners in a couple, and only 5 examined partnered relationships. And I highlight that because for 2 reasons. 1, I do think there should be more research on couples, but 2, importantly, there's an acknowledgement that PrEP and sexual pleasure and sexual satisfaction does not have to be confined to a committed relationship. It can be defined in a much broader context. So I synthesized all of these studies, and because I was looking at quantitative studies and qualitative studies, I looked at the themes that were pleasure focused. And what I found was I could take those voices and I could put them into kind of 2 broad categories. The first being what PrEP has taken away. And when we think about what PrEP has taken away, individuals in these studies talked about taking away sexual anxiety and fear. Also talked about removing barriers to physical closeness. The other subcategory was PrEP, what PrEP has added to relationships. It has added increasing intimacy and added sexual options. So I want to take a couple of slides to go through the actual voices of the individuals in these studies. First theme is PrEP as reducing sexual anxiety and fear. And for this, you have to realize that for many, HIV is a real fear. It's a fear that lies behind all sexual encounters. And what a lot of individuals talked about is by taking PrEP, it's freer. You know, sexuality is your core. And it only makes sense that when it's freer, they kind of refer to it as a second coming out. Another participant talked about who wants to be intimate with someone and be in a state of terror. So PrEP can take away that state of terror. And kind of maybe best summed up, sex is allowed to be enjoyable again. There was also a sense that PrEP can transform from sex being synonymous with risk to sex now being associated with pleasure again. The second theme that we talked about was PrEP as removing barriers to physical closeness. Now, this is practical. If you're on PrEP and you're in a seriodiscordant relationship, you don't have to use condoms anymore. And that's a practical barrier that's being removed. And, you know, condoms are awkward, right? And a lot of individuals in these studies talked about the frustration and the awkwardness around condom use. So this is actually a practical barrier that's being removed. So couples in committed relationships referred to PrEP as allowing them to return to live sex. People also talked about being more natural, being able to have a deeper physical connection, and also condoms experienced as totally different from skin being preferred. And then lastly, people could talk about sexual fulfillment instead of frustration. And this is a real sexual motivation. This is a real motivation around PrEP uptake. The next theme is PrEP as increasing intimacy. And this is an intimacy that means connection, both emotional and psychological, apart from the physical closeness in removing the barrier of condoms. One individual noted, it's also not just having a condom on. It's just much more intimate, that I'm actually giving my body to someone and letting them come inside me. Another individuals talked about greater physical and psychological intimacy and as a sign of a commitment to a partner. Also, the studies showed that individuals in committed relationships were likely to use PrEP to improve intimacy. And that just kind of underlines the fact that this intimacy motivation may be a good messaging around PrEP uptake. The last theme is about PrEP as increasing sexual options. And I want to say sexual diversity and sexual opportunity and sexual adventure is a good thing. It's about choice. It's about body autonomy. And it's also about reducing stigma around sexually diverse behaviors, around casual sex, sex for fun, sex for all sexual identities. So the participants in these studies really hit the nail on the head. PrEP is a get out of jail free card, making you sexier as a partner. Sex isn't meant to be something you're ashamed of or feel for love. Now I can have sex again, and it's just fantastic. So many participants use this theme, sex as being liberating, thanks to PrEP. And here, this is, I think, what our other panelists talked about, equality of access to healthy sex. So that's straight people, the sex that straight people already have. It's a way of reducing stigma, and a way, PrEP can be a way of sexual empowerment. So, and here's thanks to Jim and his PrEP for Love campaign, which is featured in the article. But in sum, these are the key takeaways. Sexual health should encompass both positive and pleasurable sexual experiences for all genders and all sexual identities. PrEP impacts relationships dynamics. So why don't you use these motivations to motivate PrEP uptake and adherence? And associating PrEP with pleasure as opposed to risk could help reduce HIV stigma towards MSM, and indeed a lot of individuals talked about PrEP stigma. The last thing I want to mention is that this fears of rampant risk compensation by persons on PrEP may in fact be overstated. The individuals who talked about condomless anal sex were already engaging in it anyway. So they weren't talking about increased condomless anal sex. They were talking about using PrEP to reduce the risks they were already taking. And I want to kind of point out with this theme about pleasure, this is also a theme around body autonomy and choice. And I don't mean to suggest that exposing oneself to STIs is necessarily a good thing. But what one participant said in one of the studies is HIV can lead to a funeral. STIs can be treated. And this is a body autonomy and a body choice that people are allowed to make these risk assessments because of the availability of PrEP. I'm including this slide because right before the manuscript was published, I did do an updated Listserv, and I revealed 5 more studies that are consistent with what's in the systematic review that you're welcome to take a look at. So lastly, in case some of you are interested, I do have a podcast that's really focused on positive sexuality. What I do is a podcast with my daughter, and we debunk myths around sexuality. Some of them that might be interested to this group is abstinence is the only way to have safe sex. Consent is only about saying no, and being sex positive is radical. So I say this is a copy of the article. And I say thank you to all for giving me this time, and thank you, Jim, for putting me on this panel. And if you have any questions, comments, or want a full text copy of the article, or interested in being a guest on the podcast, I would email me, and I'd be really happy to hear from you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was marvelous. And all of these presentations have been great. So yeah, I'm going to invite our other speakers to come back and join us online or on visual. Let me just play around with the speaker setup situation a little bit. So I see all of you. I also welcome our audience to go on camera if you'd like, and if there are things you want to raise verbally, please do so. Raise your hand and we'll put you can go on camera and ask a question. There's a few things I want to follow up on that have come up in the chat, some of the issues and discussions that have come up in the chat. I also just want to note, thank you, Christine, for sharing the PrEP for Love campaign. That was something I was part of. I helped bring it to life 5-6 years ago. And we were inspired. One of the inspirations for that campaign was research done by Dr. Sarit Golub in New York, who was looking at motivations for accessing PrEP, asking young gay men of color, what was their motivation for coming for PrEP today at the clinic. And the number one motivation was intimacy. It wasn't about like, I'm afraid of HIV. The frame was intimacy. It was a positive frame. It was wanting to have that, seeing that PrEP was an opportunity to expand intimacy. And so we were able to use, that was really helpful for us when we were creating the campaign, because I'll tell you, you know, when we were developing this 2014, 2015, it wasn't necessarily easy to frame PrEP around pleasure. It wasn't even easy back then to talk about using PrEP without condoms. Everyone was saying at the time, no, PrEP has to be used with condoms, which was, you know, basically crazy. We didn't develop PrEP to be used with condoms. We developed PrEP because condoms weren't being used. And so now we're going to tell people who don't like condoms, hey, here's this great new thing, wear a condom with it. Doesn't make any sense. But that's the message we were giving people. That's what public health was saying, that was on the label. And so when we were trying to divorce PrEP from condoms, it was not easy. And so research like this definitely helped. And so anyways, a little bit about backstory there. But I wanna and invite the panelists to weigh in on this as you wish. But it came up in the chat a couple of times and in comments from Joao, the notion of sexual violence, and you know, how do you connect and talk to communities who are experiencing sexual violence? So specifically, we had people talking about African cisgender women who face a lot of violence and sexual weaponization, and Joao talked about queer people, LGBT people, trans people, maybe being sexually objectified and used in that way, but then also facing extraordinary violence. So how do we kind of deal with those two things? How do we push forward pleasure and a pleasure frame when some of our communities are, the place where pleasure can be accessed is being used in these horrible, violent, criminal ways? So who would like to jump in on that? I'm seeing, yeah, Joao or Anne, or both of you.
You go.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I think that one of the things to deal with it is to consider that law is not enough to work with violence. We need a lot of more instruments or tools to work with violence, and it is necessary that you can approximate or get together law with education and with health and with well, seeing it in multivarious ways to face violence. There are some cultural aspects that can be considered when we talk about it, and we have to understand that in a lot of situations, maybe we need to understand better what does violence means and what does it impact. We know exactly what happens with the victim, but we don't know exactly what happened with the aggressor. And the situation of aggression have to be faced by both of that that people, the persons that are involved in it. I'm not saying that we have to understand and doing nothing, or doing nothing in the considering what needs to be done to protect the victim, but we have to know exactly what we should do to try to stop with that kind of situation. And unhappily in Brazil, it's so present, and it happens a lot.
And then I was just going to quickly add that I quickly highlighted about trauma-informed pleasure-based sexual health, but there's a great, so that The World Association of Sexual Health also had a series of journal articles that accompanied the Sexual Pleasure Declaration. And there's one written by Dennis Fortenbury, who really specializes in this area, which you can find on our website, which is about why incorporating pleasure in trauma-informed interventions for people who have experienced the whole array of sexual violence is really important, because it's more effective in that it doesn't silence the potential of their sexuality or their joy or their pleasure in future. And I think there are some similarities to work that's happened in the past and that we've been involved with around a diagnosis, an HIV diagnosis or FGM, and how, or disability, what tends to happen is that then interactions with that person who's had that experience will be that their sexuality is silenced or their pleasure is silenced. And this article kind of unpacks the importance of keeping pleasure, keeping joy, keeping desire in that conversation in a trauma-informed way. So just to let you know that that resource is out as well.
Thank you so much. Now I want to bring up something that has it's annoyed me for a long time, and I see someone just noted the term risk assessment in the chat, and so first of all, like, risk is really a 4-letter word that I think we should banish or use in very limited ways, if at all. And why is it that certain groups of people can have sex and other groups have risk behaviors? Which is deeply problematic. So I just want to put out there what your thoughts are, how we could banish risk assessments from all of our work and talk about sexual health assessments. And our first question is, how's your sex life? Are you enjoying your sex life? I don't know, if I sat down and had a doctor ask me that, I'd fall off my chair. Like, are you having a good sex? It's not about my risk. It's not about what I'm doing and try to fix that. It's more about, are you happy? Are you getting what you need? So any ideas on how, I think even when we're doing like positive programming around this, we still have people in the field, still when you show up at the prep clinic or what have you, you have you fill out a risk assessment. So we still have these things that are baked in the cake. How can we take those things out of the cake and toss them into the trash? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly. Endorse the pleasure principles, practice pleasure-based sexual health. Look at the examples of the interventions that are on our map, the global map of pleasure that are in the systematic review. There's some brilliant examples there where doctors and others have asked that question, have started. There's gold standard pleasure-based sexual health interventions are starting with that question. Are you enjoying your sex life? What do you want to gain? When did you have the most, what was your most pleasurable sexual experience? And, we all have to get a bit more used to that, but we also need to have outcomes in our interventions that are based on that all, so many of the outcomes or the ways in which interventions are measured are about STI reduction, HIV reduction. Very, very rarely do you see an intervention which is a well-being enhancement or a, improvement in the, choice made or self-esteem increasing. But they are out there. There are some great interventions. I mentioned the Sister Love intervention where they have healthy love parties. They're fantastic, where they ask these kind of questions in the discussion group. So that would be my tuppence worth on how to banish risk from the conversation.
And Christine, do you have something?
I agree. Yeah, part of the reason I did this review is it's the people who are, I work with Seth Calicman, okay? He's got, has had millions of dollars in NIH grants, and it's all about risk. And I would sit around this conference table that we had this whole seminar, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And I think that there's a problem with the researchers, and then there's the problem with the healthcare providers. And I think for me, part of the reason I started this podcast is communication. Like, you have to just talk about it. You have to be able to talk. And I have to say, guess what, Jim? I have a primary care professional who asked me about my sex life. And she's very sex positive. And she's like, how's it going? Because, she knows about my background and she knows what I do. And we need more training of those healthcare professionals who feel comfortable, because we are so socially stigmatized around, we can be sexy, but we can't be sexual. And I really do believe that small conversations will turn into larger conversations, which is why I fully endorse all that you're doing, Anne. I think it's, that's all I need to say. I'm a little bit of a fangirl here.
All right, a multiple fangirl moment. I'm fangirling everybody, all of you, all gender, I'm fanning you. I do want to bring up something that has come up in the chat and as one of our final takeaways or final moments of discussion. And it is the issue that there are some, there can be negative outcomes to like pleasurable sex or sex that doesn't include condoms. Or certain interventions. So unwanted pregnancy, there's morbidity that can be associated with STDs. And so I'm going to give sort of my take on that really quick, but I would love for you all to take on, like the what about STDs piece, which I don't want to diminish. It is an issue, and STDs can be deeply problematic and cause lots of harm. I think from the PrEP perspective, getting people engaged in PrEP means ongoing STI screening, asymptomatic screening. And we know that lots of screening in public health settings and communities can reduce transmission, right? We catch people early and we stop the chain of transmission by catching that STD and treating it. So PrEP as itself is an intervention that can reduce STIs, even if condoms aren't being used. Secondly, I would say, I think we need to be pushing for multi-purpose technologies, that people do have an interest in staying away from HIV. People have an interest in not being pregnant when they don't want to. But there's also people, we should have STI, other interventions for STIs that are not just about condoms. And, we are seeing some research now that looks like doxycycline is really a safe and effective way to deal with a number of STIs in a post-exposure prophylactic sort of way. We're going to actually have a webinar on this in a few months in October. And I know that there's some early work at MPTs, multi-purpose technologies that would potentially prevent STIs up front. But I want to hear, what you all think about when someone, I think rightly brings up, but there's STIs aren't just a small thing for some people. How do we address that best? We'll start with Pleasure Project and go to Christina, and then we'll close out.
I mean, obviously we, taking a pleasure-based approach doesn't mean, ignoring the consequences that could happen, right, from unsafe sex, but it's about changing the narrative to one that's more honest about the fact that, we do have sex for pleasure. We can enjoy sex if it's safe, if it's within our sexual rights, and it's about the links between the two, like trying to move away from that binary, but we're still saying that it's about an awareness of the consequences and how pleasure-based sexual health improves sexual health, because by having that honest conversation, and what we saw from the systematic review was people are more able to make those choices, right? So they're very enmeshed together. I would also just expand it to say that, in the systematic review, maybe not that surprising, but still quite shocking, we found no research focused on contraception uptake. So all of it was around STI and HIV testing. And we did look, and condom use. And that, of course, I mean, we have to assume that that's about gender and about the way that, pleasure is heavily gendered in terms of pleasure privilege. I think you spoke, Jim, earlier about and I like to talk about a pleasure privilege where certain groups or identities are more sanctioned to have pleasure, heterosexual married men, for example, or heterosexual married women, but then pleasure privilege diminishes when you're a more discriminated against identity. So I think that it's important that we also look at the fact that we can also look at multi-purpose technologies around contraception. It's, it's a huge gap. And I just looked up the stat for the number of abstracts at AIDS conferences that mention pleasure at all that I've done a review of, and it was less than 1%, 0.5% over the last 20 years. But in the ICPD and the family planning world, it's even lower, it's even worse. So, I think we can also look at technologies that span both, and what we're learning around pleasure and prevention can be expanded as well to the contraception field and innovations. But do you want to go now, Joel?
Yeah, I was thinking about what does we learn as medical or as doctor or something like that, or a professional, a health professional. For example, we don't learn how to introvistate, how to attend a patient and ask him, for example, or her, what are the pleasures and what parts of their bodies does they really feel pleasure, and what do they believe about it. For example, there are a lot of patients that come to me and ask me, well, I felt pleasure in my anus, and am I gay? What can I do with it? And we are not usually asking our patients or giving informations about that kind of things. And saying, for example, what it is, the pleasure that a man can feel when he has his prostate messaging or something like that. It's not in our curriculum. It's not in our knowledge. We need to know it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Such a good point. Thank you for that. And I'm gonna turn it to Christine for any thoughts on what we've been talking about, and then we'll close out the webinar.
I think I'm going to echo what Tim said. Safe sex is pleasurable sex, but also echo what Anne said, that a lot of this is about empowerment and choice. And, as we are all frustrated and angered by the recent US Supreme Court decision, we have to recognize body autonomy, and risk assessment is a personal choice. So we give everyone the tools, we tell them what's available, and hopefully we have more tools to enable more choices to have sexual activity be as pleasurable and as safe as possible.
Well, I think that's so important to note, that safety is your construct, and I feel safe for me is not what someone else may be safe. So when we kind of impose like the zero, like there could be no potential negative outcomes at all, that's just not going to work for most people. There are people who are more than willing to risk getting an STI and avoid HIV. There are people who are more concerned about getting pregnant than getting HIV or STIs. So we have to kind of meet people where they're at, right? And help them find the best tools they can have to have the sex life they want to have and have it as safe as possible. But when we kind of create safety as a zero-sum game, we end up moving into the abstinence category, because even, condoms are not 100% effective against anything. And so are we going to start telling the only way you can have pleasure is to not touch another human being or be 6 feet apart? And I wish we had more time to talk about this, but I just want to note that we are in the era of monkeypox, and monkeypox is not necessarily an STI that we understand at the moment, but it is something that's transmitted through close contact during sex. And so how is monkeypox going to just complicate all of this even more, or is complicating? We really can't dive into it now, unfortunately, but I put it out there. I just want to note that it came up in the chat, and it's an important thing for all of us to think about. I want to thank you all for being here. It was a really great conversation. I want to thank our speakers, Anne, Joao, and Christine, to all of you for coming. We will be sharing we'll be sharing the resources. I'm gonna ask people to mute. We're gonna be sharing the resources shortly. You can find them on our website, but also we'll send you an email with links to the recording, the great links that were shared, as well as the slides. So without further ado, I'm going to close out this session today. I hope to see you in August for our discussion on cabotegravir for PrEP. In the meantime, take good care and do the good work promoting pleasure in every way you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim, for organizing this. It was
Yeah,
amazing.
thank you very much. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, pay her according to what she said. How did I work?